Okay, so we're back. I think we're back. We're back. Yeah, I think we're back. I don't know why I'm looking like that down there. Like there's like someone's tell me something about this. There's clearly no one to tell me about this. Okay, unless there is someone in there, isn't there? Sorry, I'm like 2 minutes late. I bought a new coffee machine and I keep using it wrong. But it does make cappuccinos at the touch of a button, which is lovely and definitely worth the money. Okay, so Jekyll and Hyde. So obviously, like totally different book to Shakespeare's play, but one of the things that we can really key into is the fact that we do think about these things when we set these texts. Is that we can like play across themes across different texts. Thirsty. Oh, water. Hey, water down here. Oh, sorry, I've just come back from a break. Hey, Haribo. Okay, so one of the things we think about is that this still has that sort of critical idea of the primal versus the non-primal. So it's got this idea of like this huge idea of, at the center of human beings, is there something innately evil or is there something innately good? Okay, so is Prospero purely a good character or does he have a seat of evil? I would argue, yes, he's a horrible person. And what happens, obviously, in the Victorian period is we get rapid urbanization, rapid development of the city, and we also get the huge, like, absolute ontological change that's like the thought about yourself. So the massive change in thinking, what we might call a paradigm shift. The paradigm shift is when sort of everyone starts thinking about things in a totally different way. So the huge paradigm shift of thought, which is about evolution and the work of Darwin. Sorry, I almost forgot the name of Charles Darwin then. That's hugely useless. Okay, so we have this huge paradigm shift in Victorian society. We also have the huge paradigm shift of rapid urbanization and the process of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution changes the nature of the city. People, instead of being cottage industry, instead of living in the country, just sort of surviving. We might call them, a lot of people, subsistence farmers. They just survive. They grow enough to survive, and so they survive. That sounds like a really, really basic idea, that what you do is you grow enough to live. But actually, for a significant portion of the history of the United Kingdom, people living on farms and growing enough food to survive and no more was pretty much the way of life. That was what happened. You might have you might grow more than you did so that you could trade with another farmer, so you didn't just eat corn all the time, which would be miserable. But then what happens is mechanization, so the development of the factory, moves people into the city, and when people move into the city, what happens is the city becomes more polluted, and we get the growth of the metropolis, and the growth of the metropolis means that society totally changes. We get a total shift in society. Now, as most of you know, as all of you know, I think my profound belief is that Jekyll and Hyde is not really about characters. It's not really about characters at all. It's not a character-driven novel. My feeling, my sort of critical feeling, is that actually Jekyll and Hyde's main character is the City of London. Most of you know that my sort of expertise in English is to do with the presentation of fictional cities, particularly cities, and so that sort of comes out. This is a piece of effectively early science fiction. We have the growth of science fiction. H.G. Wells sort of spearheads it, I guess, but this is coming out slightly before it. So a lot of scholars of science fiction suggest that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is the first piece of real popular science fiction, because it follows the right format. I think this is a critically important bit of science fiction about the splitting of the self. It is also a very theological novel. Can human beings split themselves into good and evil? This is really critically important. I think that we very much have to identify the fact that Robert Louis Stevenson is asking serious questions on what human nature is. Part of that is that he was heavily influenced is not a word. Coffee is required. It makes cappuccinos at the touch of a button. Oh, and they're good. I don't normally drink caps. Okay. So he was heavily influenced by a psychiatric patient he met who had what we now understand as multiple personality disorder. God, it's almost called syndrome. Multiple personality disorder. Now, multiple personality disorder is something that is heavily I'm going to have to use the word bastardized by the media in order to solve plots. There isn't an episode of pretty much anything that doesn't use the Deus Ex Machina of, oh yeah, it's fine, he had multiple personality disorder, that's why he was like that. This is, of course, rubbish. It is a much subtler condition than is regularly presented. But we know that Stevenson met this guy and he was heavily influenced by this idea that more than one consciousness could exist in the same physical body. And he took it to the extreme of good versus evil. That is simply not the case in terms of psychiatry and psychology. That's not how it works. And please don't be sort of influenced by media. I think there's a film out at the moment. I was about to say, is there? Can someone tell me what this is? But of course, you're at the other end of a computer, so that is entirely pointless, isn't it? I think there's a film out at the moment. I've seen the trailers for it, and it looks like it's going to fit in that common canon of, oh, one's good, one's evil. Oh, personalities are trying to kill each other off. This is questionable at best. Okay, but we know Stevenson is influenced by this. We also know that the Victorian society began to become very, very heavily interested in psychiatry and in the self as a ruptured self, as a broken self. I know I use this word rupture all the time, but it is something that exists in literature a lot. And we can also talk about the ruptured city here as well, which I'll talk about. We know this turns up in like chapter 4, chapter 5 quite a lot. To answer a question I was asked about how well you should know where in a text a quotation is coming from. To be honest, the person that asked me, was saying, do I need to know where in a chapter it is? Not really, unless it's something like the first line of a chapter, because that then is a structural point. What you need to know is sort of where in the text it is. Now, of course, these questions are dependent on me. I'm saying things that I would intend to be taken seriously in terms of like 7s, 8s, and 9s. Like if you are aiming on getting those like top grades, then yes, you might need to know those things, but don't put learning. I think my blind's trying to escape. Don't put learning where in a chapter a line is over learning sort of interesting context and interesting ideas and presentations and thematic stuff like that. An examiner is going to be much more impressed by you knowing, like what's going on in Victorian society and being able to analyse language. If you can identify like sobriquet, synecdoche, and metonymy and stuff like this, then you're going to do way better than the guy that knows, or girl, that knows that it's like line 34 in Act 1, Scene 2. I don't know what that is. Okay, so make sure you put like technical knowledge first, as opposed to like just being able to trot out where in a book something is. So Stevenson grew up in a family that wasn't like terribly Christian. He wasn't like hugely influenced by that, and he sort of lost his religion as well. It's so quite sort of interesting in that he's quite an interesting writer in terms of he took what was around him going on at the time and tried to understand it through his writing. Now, of course, the other thing about Robert Louis Stevenson that's quite interesting is that actually most of what he's known for is children's books, particularly Treasure Island and Kidnapped, and he wrote like a collection of children's poems as well, A Child's Garden of Verse it was called, and he's actually been a really huge influence on other writers. People like Nabokov state that he was of huge influence. It's really interesting because like Nabokov writes this hugely controversial novel Lolita, which is sort of the thing that makes him famous. People like Hemingway as well. Hemingway is like this hugely quite a sad character actually, in terms of he shot himself on his balcony. He's a really experimental writer in the start of the 20th century. Stevenson, as I say, this is like he was very ill for most of his childhood as well, and he's quite just sort of reasonably sad figure in that way. He stayed inside a lot. Some critics suggest, some critical historians suggest that he actually wrote this novel, and then he was so unhappy with it that he burnt it. Sorry, I'm just gonna move, my back's killing me. That he burnt it, and then he wrote it again over 3 days purely from memory, which is quite interesting, but I'm not entirely sure there's enough evidence for that. It seems to be a lot of like hearsay and conjecture terms. Okay, so what's the novel actually about? The novel is about a man called Mr. Utterson, who's a lawyer, and he tries to solve this mystery of the door, effectively. This mystery of why an old friend of his, Dr. Jekyll, seems to keep disappearing, and especially why Dr. Jekyll has had his will changed to leave all his money to this character, Mr. Hyde. Now, one thing we can start with is noticing the titles from Jekyll and Hyde. Okay, Jekyll has Doctor, Hyde has Mr. Interesting. Now, there is this thing about like surgeons and doctors still, where surgeons demand to be called Mr. Doctors demand to be called Doctor, even though surgeons are qualified doctors. But I don't know how relevant that is at this point. Hyde is not a surgeon. That is never mentioned during the course of it. But this idea of like learning versus primal. So, Utterson. So chapter 1. So again, I'm going to do this in a similar way to Tempest, but I'll probably move a little quicker. And yes, I will send out this document. The last couple of chapters on my document for Jekyll and Hyde aren't quite finished yet. Actually, I can probably just if you're like logged on at the moment, you can can view. Let me just like pop this out to you straight away. Bing. No. Yes. Okay, so you should have this file now shared with you as can view. You'll notice that it's missing the last couple of chapters. That's just because I'm going to do them off my copy of the text. Again, if you don't have a copy of the text at home and you want to look at it, it is on Wikipedia as the entire text. This text is more than 50 years old. It's more than 100 years old, so it's out of copyright. So it's released. That's how it works in literature. So you can just sort of get hold of it for free. Okay, so the very first quotation in chapter 1, the very first line of this entire novel: Mr. Utterson the lawyer was a man of rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile. Interesting. This is what we would refer to as an eponymous novel. It is named after the main characters, Jekyll and Hyde, and yet we start with someone totally different. That is interesting. It immediately creates this slightly bizarre dissonance that we're sort of unsure where this is going. So structurally, Stevenson does something interesting from the very first sentence. He immediately starts the novel with someone we don't expect it to be started with. We don't actually know who... oh, hi, Yen and George now on this file. Hi, guys. We actually don't know who this is sort of meant to be about, but we know from the title that it's meant to be about those two. So immediately we get Utterson. Sorry. All right. Now there's not much there really. I mean, aside from that, aside from the fact you're never lighted by a smile, this is an unhappy man or a very serious man. He's the serious lawyer. He's a rugged countenance. I like to think of him as sort of quite a Dickensian character. He sort of falls in this canon of what Dickens regularly presents as sort of like very stern, very professional men who sort of just get on with their job, just get on with life. And there's certainly a sense of a part of Victorianism is about the fact that characters regularly try and appear as one thing, but underneath they have this sort of want for adventure. In fact, Stevenson, one of Stevenson's other novels, Treasure Island, sets up in a similar way. It has a very, very normal opening to it. It starts in a very normal way. A boy on a I've got a copy. I've definitely got a copy. No, I can't. There's no way I'm going to be able to find it at this short notice somewhere. If you're wondering whether it's intentional, incidentally, that I'm like sat in front of books, you're right. The rest of my room is a tip. So I didn't want to show you that. No, I'm not going to be able to find it. Oh, God knows where it is. Okay. So part of this is that a lot of Stevenson's novels are really based on this idea that it sets up a normal presentation of society, and then that presentation of society changes by some sort of event, and we're shown the undercurrent of it, the underbelly, the sort of brutal primalism of society. We go from this like lovely little fishing town in Treasure Island. We go in this normal little fishing town, and then in this very sort of quiet pub where no one ever goes really, and then what we're taken on is this sort of journey across the sea. But yeah, again, a children's novel. So Stevenson sort of grows up, sort of makes his name really writing novels for children, or at least what we now see as novels for children. Utterson, never lighted by a smile. Now, he's described as being, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of downgoing men. This is hideously prophetic. So structurally, even though this full opening section just describes how normal Utterson is and how absolutely uninfluenced by the outside world, absolutely like lacking any sort of adventure in his life. It describes him as not even bothering to drink nice wine. He'll drink gin instead. Now, the social mention of this is that at this point in time, gin is very is a cheap drink. He says it assuages his taste for fine vintages. So instead of drinking nice wine, he drinks normal gin. And at this point in time, gin is seen as drink of the poor. We know this from like slightly later on as well. Obviously, through time that changes. Drinks become fashionable and unfashionable. At the moment, gin is an incredibly fashionable drink. Like small batch gin is incredibly expensive, things like this. So it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of downgoing men. We're given this statement that he is the last good thing that people who are effectively about to die get. The death penalty is still relatively common, and he is the last thing that they see. He's the last attempt to make them feel better. That's quite important. Bikram, I've sent the quotations. They're there. Just have a look. Sorry, I just have a go at Bikram. I actually haven't. I know I have, because 5 of you are looking at them at the moment. Okay, so there's the next quotation. The street was small and what is called quiet, but it drove a thriving trade on the weekdays. Now, the important thing about that statement, and this statement is probably not really, I don't know whether there's actually that much point in you learning it. The street was small and what is called quiet, but it drove a thriving trade on the weekdays. But sometimes it's really worth just learning like tiny little phrases. What is called quiet in chapter 1 is hugely important. What is called quiet? The insinuation of this by Leto is that it's not quiet. That it actually sort of presents as, oh, we found it, have we, Pickering? Well done. The insinuation is that people call it quiet, but actually it's not. So what is it? Why is it called quiet? It's called quiet because it's safe. And this is about a presentation of Victorian London, what Victorian London was actually like. And what it was like was incredibly judgmental and territorial. So we know later on in this novel that we have places and elements that are stigmatized either for or against. So we know that Cavendish Square is presented positively, but we know that Soho is presented very negatively. Very interesting that we have these ideas that living in an area says a lot about you as a person. And we have this again in this same text, and this is really about the internal presentation of London here. Well, it was this way, returned Mr. Enfield. I was coming home from some place at the end of the world. Now, one idea about this is that London is presented as just the entire world, just like shrunk down into this little tiny version of London. So the entire world has been cramped. And actually, it's not even that. If you look at a map, like, go and look at a map at some point, find Cavendish Square and then find Soho Square. They are like walkable to each other. In fact, they're really walkable. They're like, you know, all the trains have stopped. I can definitely make it sort of walkable. And so they are what Stevenson presents is just this axis across which entire society runs. And Enfield describes London as a place at the end of the world. I love this idea that part of London represents the far reaches of society, but also the far reaches of geography. And that's really critical. Okay, the horror, and what's viewed here, what Enfield saw when he was coming back from the place at the end of the world, is the horrible part is Hyde killing someone. And he says, the horrible part of the thing, for the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. If you haven't spotted the oxymoron there, then you're a little bit in trouble. For the man trampled calmly over the child's body. Trampled calmly is a beautifully learnable oxymoron about the presentation of Hyde. And it's also indicative of the fact that Hyde is made up of multiple parts. The oxymoron sort of presents the dichotomy and the dissonance that is in him. He is all at once calm and evil. Because when we think about the whole of the text and the whole of the narrative, Hyde doesn't mind that he is doing bad things. It's not even that he actively seeks to do them. It's just they're part of a mundane, regular life. His evil is just part of him. And so how does he describe, how we described him to as well? That's freaking foul. Coffee. Cheers. Okay, so the child is trampled to death. Well, sorry, not trampled to death. The child is trampled. That'll be a change. The child is trampled, and what we have is a group of bystanders. Now, this is actually quite nice, isn't it? What we're given is this nice bit of London, and then we're given like people stood around trying to help the child. But then they actually do something quite cruel, and that is their most important thing is, and it's described as it's not on the sheet actually. It's described as we screwed him out of £100. and that meaning is still the same. Actually, that's not like that hasn't changed. That doesn't mean anything different. They actually screwed him out of £100. And the idea is that what they seek from this situation isn't necessarily immediately the girl's health, it's to get money. Now, if that isn't a reflection of Hyde's inherent evil, then I don't know what is. That actually Hyde being around people encourages others to be cruel, in a way. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that Hyde did the right thing. What I'm saying is that Hyde encourages in others a reflection of his own evil. And actually, if we think about it in a grand scheme, Utterson is encouraged by Hyde's story to be a sort of like cruelly adventurous person, and to actually sort of try and Hamza, I'll answer that in a second. It sort of encourages him to be a cruel person immediately. And okay, so we again get an oxymoron to describe Hyde. Hyde is constantly described with oxymorons, okay, all the way through it. And just learning a couple of them will help you a lot. Try and learn a couple from different places in the novel, just in case they give you a novella, I should say, just in case they give you an extract where you've learnt it. Because remember, the question will ask you in this extract and elsewhere in the novella, elsewhere in the text, I think they say text, elsewhere in the text, discuss this. Now, if they say this extract and elsewhere in the text describe the presentation of Hyde, and all of your quotations from the same bit, then you're not going to be showing elsewhere. But you can refer to other bits. Okay, so black sneering coolness. It's sneering coolness that does it. There was a man in the middle with a kind of black sneering coolness. Frightened too, I could see that, but carrying it off, sir, really like Satan. If you choose to make capital of this incident, said he, I am naturally helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene. Now there's two really important textual bits in here that you can really analyse. Obviously black sneering coolness, three. Black sneering coolness, and then really like Satan. Really like Satan is so, the simile is so obvious that it's almost pointless looking at it. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene. Now the word that makes me really interested in this is the word but. Because what Hyde's doing is he's sort of he's saying things through a sort of strange circular logic. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene. There are easier ways to say that. But his way of speaking constantly speaks with negatives. No gentleman but wishes. Okay, you have a negative, then a negative. Almost as if Hyde can't describe things in a positive way. Like he has to describe the negative version of everything. That, to me, is a really useful language point. So if you learn, no gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene, okay, as opposed to a gentleman wishes to avoid a scene, which would be the way of doing it. It's a double negative. It ends up as just being a neutral statement. Okay, the simple definition of this is a gentleman wishes to avoid a scene. But no, he has to say no gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene, because the presentation of him is such a profoundly negative one. Okay, Hamza, you've asked, when you said the book has an eponymous name, but at the start of the book it talks about someone other than Jekyll and Hyde. What does that imply? What that implies is that Stevenson wants us to have an idea of mystery about the characters from the very first statement. What he wants is that even though we're set up with a very common Victorian trope, or Victorian literature trope, which is that there is an eponymous novel which is about the person in it, and it starts with the person in it. What we actually end up getting is someone investigating something. So think about other particularly Gothic Victorian novels, or early Gothic, or early Victorian Gothic, or just late Gothic. So Dracula doesn't start with Dracula. Frankenstein doesn't start with Frankenstein. What they start with is something from a distance. So it creates this sense of the normal man ventures into the darkness, effectively. So we've talked a lot about Gothicism and darkness, and order and chaos, light and dark. So these are people that, in all of these examples, like the person that exists in light and civilization and order, like I mean, Utterson is just the most ordered character. He's a lawyer, he's the last good person, and he is like never smiles. He has no sense of adventure. He likes the theatre, but he hasn't been for 20 years. He is then sort of captivated by the darkness to venture into it, and then comes out as a light. Okay, I might skip a few. If you're following along the document, there's like 9 or 10 of you or something following along the document. Then I might skip a few just because some of them don't seem as relevant now as they used to. Okay. The next one we'll look along is this is Lanyon describing his relationship with Jekyll. Now, this is the first point we get that this idea that this novel is really about science and what science does. It is more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in mind, and though of course I continued to take an interest in him for old sake's sake, as they say, I see and have seen devilish little of the man. Such unscientific balderdash, added the doctor, flashing suddenly purple. Now, learnable, like little learnable bits are, he began to go wrong in mind. That's useful. Henry Jekyll became too fanciful. That's also learnable. You probably wouldn't want to learn all of these, but these are like little, like gobbits, yeah, reference. In order for now, I have seen devilish little of the man is lovely because of that word devilish. The adjective there is describing something that you know is useful and is proleptic. Sorry, prophetic, not proleptic. It's prophetic of later on. So it really foreshadows the fact that the character will become closer and closer to evil. Okay, so that's useful. But what this is really sort of about is the fact that Jekyll is tempted by this sort of like darkness inherent in science. Now, remember that Darwin believed he was proving something that was profoundly religious. He thought he was proving Christianity. Now, I know that sounds so odd, considering the chain of events that he started, but actually, what he thought he was doing was proving the existence of God. Okay, he thought that he was proving God's power in creating creatures that could survive in any existence, that could survive in any climate, that God could change God's own beings. But what he did actually was started a chain of events that would erode Christianity in the West and in Britain at the very least. So what we have here is a description of Jekyll's attempt to change, or not attempt, just desire to find out everything. Now, I talk about the city a lot, and how the city is reflective of the characters are reflective of the city, and that London is a character profoundly. So this presentation is really nice. He would be aware of the great field of lamps of a nocturnal city, then of the figure of a man walking swiftly, then of a child running from the doctors, and then these met, and that human juggernaut trod the child down and passed on regardless of her screams. Now, what this is oh Christ, what have I done? This is Utterson describing his own visions, that he's reliving the description that was given to him of Hyde trampling the child. But just look at the way it's presented. Firstly, lamps of a nocturnal city, which is strange because nowhere does it say it was night. So the presentation is that he actually presents evil himself as hiding in darkness. That great field of lamps of a nocturnal city is a really nice presentation of what London looks like now. Putting light in darkness doesn't stop the darkness. It just makes the darkness clearer. Obviously, like, human juggernaut is a lovely phrase, presenting Hyde as being inhuman, but at the same time human. So juggernaut is an unstoppable thing, and then passed on regardless of a screen. Things that are learnable as human juggernaut is hugely low. Now, it's at this point, so we're only in chapter 2. Chapters in this are really, really short. What we get is Utterson is now absolutely enraptured in this case. It's like in his dreams. And he delivers what is the finest and most rubbish pun in literature, in my opinion. I think it is almost truly awful. And yet, if he be Mr. Hyde, he had thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. Utterly grim. But it keys into an idea of this as being an adventure novel. It's really similar to Stevenson's other novels, and this, to me, this breaks the facade of this being a really serious novel, because I mean, I think it is. I think it's a really strong presentation of, like, corruption in a city and the difficulty of being human, the balance of evil. It raises a really interesting question about whether humans are innately evil. It's got a really clear late Gothic trope of presenting darkness as being always threatening light, as primalism always threatening civilization, and yet it's got this in it, and it's almost like Stevenson wants this to be a child's novel, and then he writes the fact about Utterson, like, driving past prostitutes in Soho, and it jars. It's really dissonant for me. I can't tell you why it's there. I can't tell you why he did it. I really want to know. But it's there, and it's worth knowing. And the pun is there, and it's sort of strangely, painfully beautiful. And so we come on to a presentation of Hyde. So this is the first time that Utterson meets Hyde, and he meets him outside the door. He stands here, he haunts the door. He's described as being like a ghost outside the door. And Hyde is presented as being pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile. He had borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness, and he spoke with husky, whispering, and somewhat broken voice. All these were points against him, but not all these together could explain the hitherto unknown disgust, loathing, and fear with which Mr. Utterson regarded him. There must be something else, said the perplexed gentleman. There is something more, if I could find a name for it. God bless me, the man seems hardly human. Something troglodytic. Now, he is actually describing Hyde to Ghoul, Jekyll's butler here. And he tries to sort of... Paul Ghoul. Sorry, I'm in... Inspector Calls now. So he's describing him to Paul. Now, Paul seems like strangely resilient to this and doesn't really care, or is, in any case, almost like actively difficult about the whole situation. But there are a couple of interesting bits. Firstly, all right, Stevenson, we get it. Okay, he looks evil. He makes people feel uneasy. Fine, we get it. So I don't know why he keeps going on it quite in the way he does. Learnable, impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. Okay, even learnable impression of deformity, lovely, really useful. even displeasing smile. Displeasing smile, possibly an oxymoron as well. It's a weak oxymoron. I'd have reservations about describing it as such, but I can see how you'd get away with it. I also like somewhat broken voice, murderous mixture for a little bit of casual alliteration as well. Notice perplexed gentleman, so he confuses people. Okay, Utterson is confused. He's constantly confused about Hyde. Now, troglodytic. A troglodyte is a prehistoric life form. Okay, so it's they would have had some evidence of it from fossils and things like this. So that's sort of a thing, and that's a thing that also obviously directly references Darwin. Okay, so this man is associated with a prehistoric nature of human beings or beings. And what this sort of touches on is this idea. So the idea of evolution was incredibly inchoate. Inchoate meaning just beginning. Incredibly inchoate. It didn't have any development to it. It wasn't really that spanned out. I mean, Darwin wasn't the first person to suggest it, but he was the first person to find what would be referred to as definite evidence about it. And so people were still trying to sort of work out what it actually meant. Did it mean that what did it mean we were descended from as humans? And this sort of directly references it. And then Utterson delivers this sort of very internal statement. Oh, my poor old Henry Jekyll. If ever I read Satan's signature upon a face, it is on that of your new friend. Satan's signature on a face is just a wonderful description of Hyde, really, and it's incredibly useful. You can trot that one out all day long. So chapter 3. What I should be telling you is actual chapter titles, shouldn't I? Because they have chapter titles. Chapter 3 is Dr. Jekyll is quite at ease. Don't be afraid about analysing chapter titles. They're still part of the text. Dr. Jekyll was quite at ease. This is meant to be surprising. We are meant to be surprised that Jekyll is at ease. We're meant to question Utterson. So Utterson and Jekyll sit down in front of a roaring fire, which could be used to represent some sort of like hidden rage or argument between them that's not quite being discussed. But upon mention of Hyde, Jekyll changes. The large, handsome face of Dr. Jekyll grew pale to the very lips, and there came a blackness about his eyes. Now, I don't know whether you've probably already spotted this, but Hyde is described as having dark black eyes at points as well, which I haven't written down. Lovely. So there is this like idea that just has a little bit of a link to it, that it starts to be prophetic of the fact that they're in some way joined together. Okay, let me finish this. I'll do those 2 questions. So that's quite a simple bit. Some of these chapters really don't have that much in them that's worth learning or pulling out. Chapter 3 is one of those. But do reread it. As I've said before, this is a really short text. You can reread it pretty quickly, and it's pretty easy. Is this actually still presenting? Am I still presenting? Yes. Someone just drop me an email and tell me whether this is still presenting. Anyone? Any of you? Oh, 14. Yeah, it's still presenting, isn't it? Okay, sorry. I'm still a little unsure about how this stuff works. Although if someone could drop me an email and just say whether this is still working and there's actually still a presentation going on, that would be lovely. Or any of the people that I know who's apparently watching this. Just drop me a message. Tell me whether it's still on. Because I have this saying offline at the moment for some reason. Oh, okay, brilliant. Thanks, Asha. Lovely. Okay, I will just after chapter 3. So I'll just answer a couple of questions. Thanks, Asha. It's appreciated. George, is the use of opium at the time of the book relevant to the presentation of split personality disorder? Unlikely, because multiple personality disorder is not normally caused by drug use, although they didn't really understand it anyway. So opium was obviously like hugely used at the time, and was a huge issue during the 1830s and 1840s. You had 2 opium wars in China over Britain's sort of horrific export of opium. I say export. So opium wasn't grown in Britain. They got it from somewhere else and then exported it to China, and this caused sort of 2 like 2 wars, as it were, which didn't end in any way. If you really want to read about some of the hideous things that Victorian Britain did abroad, read articles about the opium wars. They were grim. Now, so is that connected to multiple personality disorder? Unlikely, but there was this idea with opium that it connected people to some sort of like higher self or different interpretation of themselves. So people were fascinated by the effects of it. So that's like that's quite interesting in a way. But I'd say no, it's unlikely to be connected specifically to the presentation of multiple personality disorder, I must say. Okay, and what's the other one? There's another question somewhere. Oh, no gentleman wants to avoid, but wishes to avoid the scene. So the idea is that this is about no gentleman but wishes to avoid the scene. That Hyde can only seem to talk in negatives. Despite the fact he's saying something really quite simple. Also, what he's actually saying is that any gentleman, Hyde is sort of masquerading as a gentleman at this point, any gentleman wants to avoid being some sort of scandal for the public, and so are willing to pay off bystanders and witnesses to something in order to make things go away, as it were. Okay. We are spending a lot of time on Jekyll and Hyde. If people want to move faster or something, just drop me an email and I'll like meal a little quicker. Okay, chapter 4. Okay, chapter 4 is all about the presentation of the city. Okay, so what's going on here is that the start, we have this very obvious presentation of the city personified. So London was startled by a crime of singular ferocity and rendered all the more notable by the high position of learnable is London was startled by a crime of singular ferocity. The presentation of London as a person, as this like huge mass that can react to something in a single way, is interesting. It sort of implies that London defends itself. And again, then, although a fog rolled over the city in the small hours, the early part of the night was cloudless, and the lane, which the maid's window overlooked, was brilliantly lit by the full moon. So this is like prophetic. This is proleptic, and then undermines itself. So although a fog rolled over the city in the small hours, what it's saying is the fog is going to hide the crime, but after the crime. It was startled, and that startled nature generates the fog within this sort of strange world of Jekyll and Hyde, that it will try and hide the effects of its own crimes. It's so shocked that it sort of, there's a pathetic fallacy about the generation of the fog. And the early part of the night was cloudless. Now, brilliantly lit by the full moon. We love this idea of the full moon. The full moon in sort of Victorian nomenclature, Victorian belief, is that the full moon is specifically connected to madness. It has a real sense of madness. We get the word lunatic to mean someone that is insane from Luna, the moon. If you're sort of basking in the joy of Harry Potter, then Luna Lovegood is clearly intended to be mildly insane, purely by her name being sounding same as, well, being Luna to do with the moon, to imply madness. So what's quite important about this is the presentation of Hyde again, when he breaks people, frankly. The old gentleman took a step back with the air of one very much surprised and a trifle hurt, and at that Mr. Hyde broke out of all bounds and clubbed him to the earth. And next moment, with ape-like fury, he was trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows, under which the bones were audibly shattered and the body jumped upon the roadway. At the horror of these sights and sounds, the maid fainted. Alright, ape-like fury, incredibly learnable little simile. Now, please note, that is a simile, ape-like fury. Just because it doesn't say the fury like an ape or something like that, it's still a simile. It uses the word like. It's just a little compound. That's absolutely fine. Also, hailing down a storm of blows. You can talk about that being a little metaphor that's connected with an idea of nature as well. Hailing down a storm of blows. The semantic field is that of the weather, implying once again how connected to nature, and the primal, the sort of pre-civilized that Hyde is. So he's purely connected to this idea of being based in nature. Okay, most of you will know that, well, most of you will realise as I say it that this is sort of my favourite bit of the novel. It was by this time about 9 in the morning and the first fog of the season. A great chocolate-coloured pall lowered over heaven, but the wind was continually charging and rooting these embattled vapours, so that as the cab crawled from street to street, Mr. Utterson beheld a marvellous number of degrees and hues of twilight, for here it would be dark like the back end of evening, and there would be a glow of rich lurid brown like the light of some strange conflagration, and here for a moment the fog would be quite broken up, and a haggard shaft of daylight would glance in between the swirling reeds. The dismal quarter of Soho seen under these changing glimpses, with its muddy ways and slatternly passengers, and its lamps which have never been extinguished or been kindled afresh to combat this mournful re-invasion of darkness, seemed in the lawyer's eyes like a district of some city in a nightmare. The thoughts of his mind besides were of the gloomiest dye, and when he glanced at the companion of his drive he was conscious of some touch of that terror of the law and the law's officers which may at times assail the most honest. Okay, so what this is presenting is sort of a London that's constantly divided by Mohammed, yeah, you can link Ape-like Fury to Golden Series Evolution. Absolutely, yeah, that's a really good link. Sorry, I've missed that. So what Utterson sees is a broken section of London. He sees a London that's a mess, and he also sees London trying to hide itself. Stevenson presents this chocolate-like coloured pall lowered over heaven. A pall is a blanket put over a coffin, but it also presents like London as a heaven, an absolute heaven, which is really interesting. There's this idea of an idyll, but it's a killed idyll, an idyll that's been broken by pollution, perhaps. Chocolate coloured, also this element of brown, this brown colour links clearly to opium. So there's probably an opium interpretation of this. And what we see in the second half is that we're presented with a dismal quarter of Soho. So I've talked before about the fact that we work on an axis of good, of positive to evil, and Cavendish Square is presented as very positive, whereas Soho is presented as very negative, and that it works on that geographical axis. Dominique, a semantic field is a collection of words around a single topic used to describe things. Okay, got that? Yeah. I don't know why I'm asking whether you've got that. You clearly can't talk to me. Although you did ask me a question, so that's nice. Now, the second bit of this is like a district of some city in a nightmare. Okay, this idea of, once again, the dreams. And if we're thinking about opium in reference to this, opium terrors and opium nightmares were really common, and this is actually what we commonly regard to as a sort of post-traumatic stress disorder. People going back to things that have caused them significant harm in the past. And this goes on. As the cab drew up before the address indicated, the fog lifted a little and showed him a dingy street, a gin palace, a low French eating house, a shop for the retail of penny numbers and twopenny salads, many ragged children huddled in the doorways, and many women of many different nationalities passing out, key in hand, to have a morning glass. And the next moment the fog settled down again upon that part as brown as umber, and cut him off from his blackguardly surroundings. This was the home of Henry Jekyll's favourite, a man who was heir to £250,000 sterling. Now, £250,000 at this point is a huge amount of money. We talk about Byron being like £250,000 in debt at the end of his life. That's like equal to about 3.2 million, I think it is, when you adjust for inflation. Hyde is going to inherit a lot of money. Now, penny numbers are cheap novels. Twopenny salads are like root vegetables. This is the food of the poor. And we're presented with Soho as being just so poor. Notice the fog just lifts and shows him a little bit. Think about this as like vignettes. These are images of life in London. What we're shown here consistently is just bits of London. We're sort of absolutely given this idea that Merlin Coverley and psychogeography talks about Stevenson's London is revealed as having an equally twofold nature: the grand Victorian facades concealing poverty and repression, the wealth of London's West End offset by the squalor and misery to be found in the East. The London that Stephen creates is an allegorical one, the gaslit streets resonating through 1,000 books and films. Yet it is one devoid of specific locations and coordinates, a dreamscape that reflects the psychology of the novel's protagonists and a nightmare image of the city. The idea here is that what we get is an imagined city, a city that doesn't quite exist and will never quite exist. There's also this little stab at the French as well. France and Britain were diametrically opposed in terms of thought here at this point in time. So we have France sort of is nearly become a republic. It's a very different state at this point to Britain, and there's a very sort of tense relationship between the two. Gin, as I've said, very cheap at this point. The idea that a gin palace is a pejorative and insult for a sort of very low version of an eating house. Alright, I'm just going to take 2 minutes to, am I 5? Yeah, give me like a minute. I probably won't turn off the live stream. I'm just going to go and grab a really, really quick coffee, because this actually, I'm not going to lie guys, it's incredibly hard work just presenting to what is effectively a distant audience. So I'm just going to refill my coffee, and then I'll be back in 2. Okay, hi guys, I'm sort of back. Alright, so where were we? Let's just find where. Okay, chapter 5 then. So as I've said, really short novella, very popular in the Victorian era. They loved really short novels. This was the idea that, well, you know, in the previous quotation we just looked at, Stevenson actually sort of almost jokes at it. Oh, Hannah, I'll answer those two first. Okay, so a vignette is an image of something presented instead of a narrative. So instead of telling a whole story about something, you just present an image from it in order to indicate something. So what Stevenson does is gives us these little vignettes of life in Soho just to try and like make it look like all these stories, but doesn't actually sort of show it. Doesn't bother to meander through it, as it were. Doesn't bother to take the time to look at it. A dreamscape is a landscape in dreams. Okay, it's a really nice little word. Not used that often, but it's quite useful. So a dreamscape is the landscape of dreams. Okay. Okay. So chapter 5. It was late in the afternoon when Mr. Utterson found his way to Jekyll's door, where he was at once admitted by Poole and carried down to the kitchen offices and across a yard which had once been a garden to the building which was indifferently known as the laboratory or dissecting rooms. The doctor had bought the house from the heirs of a celebrated surgeon, and his own tastes being rather chemical than anatomical had changed the destination of the block at the bottom of the garden. It was the first time that the lawyer had been received in that part of his friend's quarters, and he eyed the dingy windowless structure with curiosity and gazed round with a distasteful sense of strangeness as he crossed the theatre, once crowded with eager students and now lying gaunt and silent, the tables laden with chemical apparatus, the floor strewn with crates and littered with packing straw, and the light falling dimly through the foggy cupola. Okay, one word to just obviously clear up is cupola. A cupola is a glass dome intended to allow light in somewhere. You've got to remember, like, artificial light in the Victorian period is not that great, to be honest. So you've either got gas light, electric light, which is only just very starting. In fact, it's probably not starting. It's probably gas light or flames at this point, which are flickery and a bit useless. So a cupola is intended to let light into a building. But notice, again, the use of fog to imply that something is being hidden. Stevenson does it as a motif. It keeps coming up. Fog, all the time. Now, let's just go back to the start of that quotation. So, notice that there is a huge change in things, or there has been a huge change in things. across a yard that had once been a garden. So in the past there has been something natural here and beautiful and loving, but actually now it's fallen to disrepair. Also, indifferently known as the laboratory or dissecting rooms. There's a nice little reference in here. The doctor had bought the house from the heirs of a celebrated surgeon. Now, the celebrated surgeon is probably John Hunter, the man whose collection would eventually end up as its own museum, the Hunterian Brilliant Museum. We can't say that for certain, but it is probably true. So this used to have a sort of a teaching area. So he says this: once crowded with eager students and now lying gaunt and silent. So we're given the idea that at one point this place was a sort of haven for learning about people, haven for learning about the human body, but now it's gaunt and silent. Gaunt, this idea of sort of a death-like pallor, this idea that things are drawn and difficult, and now it's silent. The tables laden with chemical apparatus, the floor strewn with crates and packing straw. This was once a sort of ordered place that was a celebrated area for learning, but now it's not. Now it is strewn with packing crates, littered with straw, and light can't even get into it. The change in presentation from what this used to be like to what it is now is huge, and this entirely encapsulates through a physical manifestation the change in the biology of Jekyll and Hyde. Okay, so Jekyll has given up progress and has now become something totally different. Mohammed, what are you asking? So can you say the letter from Jekyll and Maids cannot call vignettes? No, you can't actually. But actually a really good question. You can't say they are, because a vignette is about a description. It is about describing a sort of static image as a scene and just letting it pass by. Okay, so one book that does this a lot is Louis Aragon's Paris Peasant. Sorry, I might actually need to check what I'm showing in order to see whether I actually show you these books or just hold them. Yeah, Louis Aragon's Paris Present. This is like the first piece of truly psychogeographic literature as well, so of very much interest to me. But Louis Aragon, this is about just about like a street in 1920s Paris. It's actually not a terribly exciting book. You can see that I've clearly read it and actually can't really remember what it's quite about, but this is entirely vignette based, which makes it incredibly dull to read in a way, but it's quite interesting in its sort of structure. So yes, while I'm answering questions, Dominique, do you think we'll ever get a question on a random character like Dr. Lanyon or not? My sort of heart says no, to be honest. My brain says if they would, then at least you've got the extract anyway. So you can always start with the extract and then refer to other areas. Lanyon isn't that bizarre of a character. If you were going to go for like super random characters, it's going to be someone like Mr. Guest. That would be appalling. No, I don't think they are. My gut feeling this year is that they're going to give you someone who's pretty obvious. I don't want to tell you what I think it will be, because inevitably loads of you will go out and learn like specifically about that character, and will end up being inevitably, I will be wrong, to be honest. But I'm going to tell you anyway. I don't think it's going to be Hyde, just because the practice paper they sent out at the start of the year was Hyde. So, but actually, as I say that, they might present. So the question is likely to be character and presentation. So one of the ones you've seen is how they present Hyde as a frightening outsider. Like we might get Hyde as something else on a different extract, for instance. You know, you might get like Hyde as a force of nature or something like that. That seems like brutally difficult, but My gut feeling is because it's the new exam spec and they're already backtracking on things, they're not going to present something as being crazy tough. Yeah. Okay. Oh god. It's like, okay, so this is like an hour and 10 minutes already on this one. How much more have they? Part of me feels like we'll just sort of skip some junk. Okay, presently after he sat on one side of his own hearth with Mr. Guest, his head clerk upon the other, and midway between, at a nicely calculated distance from the fire, a bottle of a particular old wine that had long dwelt unsunned in the foundations of his house. The fog still slept on the wing above the drowned city, where the lamps glimmered like carbuncles, and through the muffle and smother of these fallen clouds the procession of the town's life was still rolling in through the great arteries with sound as of a mighty wind. Okay, two bits very quickly, I think, on this. A bottle of a particular old wine that had long dwelt unsunned in the foundations of his house. Utterson's drinking wine again. He is excited. He's not drinking gin. He has a taste for adventure again. And then the second bit, obviously, about presentation, the fog still slept on the wing above the drowned city. Presentation again of drowned city. That the fog drowns the city. It hides it. It suppresses it. It dulls the senses so people are enraptured by violence. We regularly talk about what am I trying to say? The Jack the Ripper murders, which come a few years after this is published, but they do present a similar view. If you want to do Jack the Ripper, read this book. This is From Hell. It's a absolutely fantastically beautiful graphic novel about Jack the Ripper. Lovely thing, worth reading. Lovely. Okay, and then there's that word carbuncles, where the lamps glimmered like carbuncles. A carbuncle base means a red, like ruby-like precious stone, but it also means a sore, as in an injury, a sore. So it's got that double meaning that's quite interesting. On one hand, something beautiful. On the other hand, something horrendous and difficult. Okay, now there's a rather singular resemblance. The two hands are in many points identical, only differently sloped. This is the description of Hyde's own letter, and it sort of indicates that he writes with his left hand as opposed to his right. Left-handed. The left hand is, in many cultures, actually seen to be evil in some way, due to people's sort of propensity for being right-handed. And the left, the word sinister comes from sinestra, the Latin word for left. So the idea that the left side of the body is evil in some ways is sort of regularly sort of pandered around. So this is a really obvious statement, and you can learn differently sloped, can't you, quite easily, and just trot that out at any point. Now, chapter 6. Interesting. Much of his past was unearthed. This is about Hyde. So Hyde's gone to ground, he's disappeared. Much of his past was unearthed, indeed, and all disreputable tales came out of the man's cruelty, at once so callous and violent, of his vile life, of his strange associates, of the hatred that seemed to have surrounded his career. But of his present whereabouts, not a whisper. From the time he had left the house in Soho on the morning of the murder, he was simply blotted out, and gradually, as time drew on, blah, blah, blah. Okay, what's interesting about this is we know that Hyde hasn't existed for that long by the end of the novel. So how has this life come? Like, where has this come from? There's this really strange sense that... Okay, some people suggest that like Stevenson's novel isn't really that well put together. And it's not actually that well written either, and that he sets up a couple of storylines early on that never go anywhere, and that there are a few characters that are just like so flimsy it's unbelievable. Mr. Guest, for instance, the Guest. Oh my god, his name's Guest. Like this is practically a joke, isn't it? And the hide seek bit as well that I mentioned just before the break. So yeah, a lot of people do sort of indicate this possibly isn't the best put together novel in the world, and this is a huge plot hole. Okay, this next section is about Lanyon, actually. So Lanyon has, we now know, well, we don't know as we read this for the first time, but due to the fact we've all read the novel, Lanyon knows Jekyll and Hyde's secret. Okay, so he absolutely knows what's going on. But he's there is a physical manifestation of Lanyon's own difficulty. The rosy man had grown pale, his flesh had fallen away, he was visibly balder and older, and yet it was not so much these tokens of a swift physical decay that arrested the lawyer's notice, as a look in the eye and quality of the manner that seemed to testify to some deep-seated terror of the mind. It was unlikely that the doctor should fear death, and yet that was what Utterson was tempted to suspect. Notice the reference to eyes. Eyes keep turning up. Stevenson seems to have this faith that eyes will tell you everything. Okay, that there is a look in your eyes that will tell you so much. And yeah, as a look in the eye and a quality of manner that seemed to testify to some deep-seated terror. Very, very interesting that he keeps talking about eyes. And the next section is one thing to mortify curiosity, another to conquer it. And it may be doubted if, from that day forth, Utterson desired the society of his surviving friend with the same eagerness. He thought of him kindly, but his thoughts were disquieted and fearful. He went to call indeed, but he was perhaps relieved to be denied admittance. He preferred to speak with Poole upon the doorstep and surrounded by the air and sounds of the open city. This idea of openness, the city being a comfort, the city being something that can protect him, is quite interesting, considering most of Hyde's crimes happen in the open city. And I think this presentation of Utterson as being relieved not to be admitted is really important. Utterson thought he was the sort of man that could confront the issue, but at the same time he actually can't. He knows that he can't really do it. He has no real sort of ability. He's just a lawyer, he's just a regular man. He falls back from that last bit of fear, that he fears actually confronting his friend. Now that Lanyon's died, he knows that the only good that can come of this is possibly to not be admitted to the house. Okay, this last chunk that's on the... Oh, sorry, there's two. We'll just skip the first one. This last chunk that's on the set, it was a wild, cold, seasonable night of March, with a pale moon lying on her back as though the wind had tilted her, and flying wrack of the most diaphanous and lawny texture. The wind made talking difficult and flecked the blood into the face. It seemed to have swept the streets unusually bare of passengers besides, for Mr. Utterson thought he had never seen that part of London so deserted. Okay, again, London stands in for society here. London is afraid of what Utterson will find out. This is sort of turning into the denouement of the story, that final tying up of things. Once again, I love the personification of the pale moon, lying on her back as if the wind tilted her. Okay, so things are slightly strange. That tilt really stands in for the fact that things are unusual, things are disrupted, are dissonant. Can you tell that dissonance is one of my favourite words at the moment? So this sort of failure for even nature to stand upright is quite interesting. Diaphanous means only just there, like strips of fabric. So it's as if there's like strips of cloud in the air, but it also sort of stands in for this idea of things being slightly broken as well. And then the streets are unusually bare of passengers. No, they use the word passengers. I find this really interesting, as if people are sort of travelling within London, and London is their sort of vehicle. I think it's actually like genuinely an interesting way of looking at things, that London is merely a vehicle that carries them through life. Okay, what I'm going to do is, I know that the file ends there, which is fine because I'm going to be working from something else. Okay, we then get like we get Lanyon's narrative. So what we get is a nested narrative, which is sort of an what we possibly refer to as an epistolary novel. So a novel that now appears in episodes, and through like nested episodes at that. And Lanyon's narrative isn't perhaps as useful as we think in terms of actually analyzing language, but what we do get is a really nice presentation of Jekyll's own house. So sorry, I'm just gonna like copy stuff in as I'm going along here. For those of you following along, those 11 of you, it's quite nice. Thank you for being here, guys. I know it's like a hideously sunny day outside, and it's probably, well, as I say, you might be sat outside, so you might be fine anyway. Okay, so here I proceeded to examine its contents. The powders were neatly enough made up, but with not with the nicety of the dispensing chemist, so that it was plain they were of Jekyll's private manufacture. And when I opened one of the wrappers, I found what seemed to me a simple crystalline salt, of a white colour. The phial to which I'd next turned my attention might have been about half full of a blood-red liquor, which was highly pungent to the sense of smell and seemed to me to contain phosphorus and some volatile ether. At the other ingredients I could make no guess. Okay, so what we've got here is this sort of presentation of chemistry intended for people that don't really know what chemistry is. But what we get is this really, really clear marker, don't we? Blood red liquor, which was highly pungent to the sense of smell and seemed to me to contain phosphorus and some volatile ether. Phosphorus is incredibly flammable, as many of you will perhaps know. But this idea that half full of a blood red liquor, the idea of it being half full as well, like also half empty, possibly we see Utterson's positive attitude to life, while we may see Jekyll's lack of positivity at the same time. It becomes what's called a shibboleth, something that divides people. And so as we sort of move towards the end of the novel, what we're consistently presented with now is conversation. So the whole nature of the novel changes. Things slightly change, and we get in terms of how they're actually structured, but we also get the sort of great element of change, don't we? So we get this sort of absolute moment when the entire novel undoes itself, and here it is, really. He thanked me with a smiling nod, measured out a few minims of the red tincture and added one of the powders. The mixture, which was at first of a reddish hue, began in proportion as the crystals melted to brighten in colour, to effervesce audibly and to throw off small fumes of vapour. Suddenly, and at the same moment, the ebullition ceased, and the compound changed to a dark purple, which faded again more slowly to a watery green. My visitor, who had watched these metamorphoses with a keen eye, smiled, set down the glass upon the table, and then turned and looked upon me with an air of scrutiny. So this is Hyde visiting Utterson, and Utterson mixing up the sort of mixture that he'd wanted to be mixed all along, but of course things had just sort of gone wrong. And we're presented with Utterson's own sort of reaction to this as well. He put the glass to his lips and drank in one gulp. A cry followed. He reeled, staggered, clutched at the table and held on, staring with injected eyes, gasping with open mouth. And I looked. There came, I thought, a change. He seemed to swell. His face became suddenly black and the features seemed to melt and alter. And the next moment I'd sprung to my feet and leapt back against the wall, my arms raised to shield me from that prodigy, my mind submerged in terror. Once again, we get this idea of like being submerged. So we've got the like drowned city, and now we have submerged terror. We also get the idea of blackness standing in for some sort of evil or unnatural element, and we also get I like this idea. His features seem to melt and alter. That he still can't quite. Like Stevenson still presents Utterson as not quite understanding what's going on, still just sort of slightly struggling to actually present what's going on within his own sort of internal monologue and his own reported speech. Notice that we do from time to time like lapse in and out of Utterson's voice, it seems. Sorry, obviously it's talking rubbish on me, aren't I? This is actually Lanyon's narrative, not Utterson's. I am talking rubbish, please ignore that, that's great. And so this is like Lanyon's presentation. And then in our final chapter we get Jekyll's own voice. So someone asked me earlier whether you can like state letters and Jekyll's presentation as vignettes. You can't, because they're far too narrative. So what we actually get is we get this epistolary nature instead, this element that things are told in episodes, and that the actual narrative is told from various different viewpoints in order to present different elements differently, as it were. Lanyon is sort of Lanyon is afforded a different viewpoint. So in the final section, Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case, we notice a couple of things that are quite interesting about Jekyll, and there's a couple of really nice structural points. I'm just gonna pull one across. This is the start of a sentence, despite the fact it says "and," which is really, really unusual for a Victorian writer. This is far more experimental in terms of grammar than you'd normally expect. And indeed, the worst of my faults was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition, such as has made the happiness of many, but such as I found it hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high and wear a more than commonly grave countenance before the public. Hence it came about that I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached the years of reflection and began to look round me and take stock of my progress and position in the world, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of me. Duplicity meaning split between two things, someone that presents two fronts. It's as if half of this sentence is missing, which, and this is like really pushing interpretation here, the fact that he starts with the word "and" may indicate that half of Jekyll has always been missing. And he says, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of me. It's not that Jekyll created himself to be duplicitous. It's that he already was, and he simply made it sort of physical. Jekyll is presented as always having been split. He says, sorry, I regarded and hid them. This is about his pleasures. I regarded and hid them with an almost morbid sense of shame. I was thus rather the exacting nature of my aspirations than any particular degradation of my faults, and made me what I was, and with a deeper trench than in the majority of men, severed in me those provinces of good and ill which divide and compound men's dual nature. He says quite clearly that he thinks all humans are divided. So, does Stevenson profoundly believe this, or is he just presenting an angry, dangerous character who doesn't really realise what he's doing? Possible. But I think profoundly Stevenson is heavily influenced by the idea that in society, as well as anywhere, in society as a whole, as well as inside the single human, we are divided as creatures, that this is an argument about what it means to be human. And he actually says, which led wholly towards the mystic and transcendental, reacted and shed a strong light of this consciousness. With every day and from both sides of my intelligence, the moral and the intellectual, I thus drew steadily nearer to the truth by whose partial discovery I have been doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck, that man is not truly one, but truly two. I say two, but the state of my knowledge does not pass beyond that point. So actually Jekyll is unhappy with the fact that he only divided himself in two in a way. He sort of sees that there may well have been more than two, more than sort of two selves in humanity. Now this chapter is the longest one, and it is hugely long, and probably is getting to the point where we are just sort of tiring everyone out. I don't know about you guys, but I'm absolutely trashed about doing this. Sorry, I've just seen Asher, I've just seen your question. I'm just thinking about it. How strong? Ash has asked how strong are the links between Jekyll's duplicity and the Christian values of angels and devils, good and evil, in the novella. I think I'm not. I don't think that's. I think in terms of interpretation, you can interpret it in that way. Absolutely, I think that's entirely relevant. I think in terms of actually what I personally believe Stevenson implies is. I think he's talking more really about the idea of how science divides people, and how actually looking he's looking at what humanity is like without religion. So if you take religion away, what happens to humans? And that becomes quite interesting. I think what he's really stating is, in terms of intellectualism and morality, once you shed them away, what then happens to the nature of a human? Does it just descend to being sort of descend to being an amoral character, effectively? Okay. So what Stevenson does do here as well is he gives us a physical manifestation of the evil that's within Hyde. No, yes. So he is, and it's in the hands. So he just describes the hands as lean, corder, knuckly, of a dusky pallor, and thickly shaded with a swart growth of hair. It was the hand of Edward Hyde. I must have stared upon it for nearly half a minute, sunk as I was in the mere stupidity of wonder, before terror woke up in my breast, as sudden and startling as a crash of cymbals. And bounding from my bed, I rushed to a mirror. At the sight that met my eyes, my blood was changed in something exquisitely thin and icy. Now, notice exquisitely thin and icy, that oxymoron again, exquisitely thin. There's two words that just do not go together. So we are constantly, like, confronted, like Stevenson consistently confronts us with these difficult difficult descriptions of things structurally. We're also only given this really detailed this really detailed physical description of Hyde right in the end of the novel, and it only comes from Hyde himself, or Jekyll himself, really. The only way that Hyde can be confronted is effectively by himself. So everyone else just describes him as effectively undescribable, but Jekyll describes him as being describes him in this actual way, this genuine physical way. But even then, it doesn't quite fulfill the need we have as a reader for a proper physical manifestation. Okay, has anyone got any more questions, like, now? Otherwise, I'm gonna sort of call it there, I think. It is interesting at the end that the ending of the novel is relatively ambiguous in a way. Let's just look at that quickly. We'll just do that. So if you've got any questions, you'd like pop them in now. Otherwise, I'll wrap up on this end. That's your sort of 5-minute warning, as it were. So we get these. We get Jekyll's sort of knowledge that he can't control the evil within him, and the evil of Hyde. Again, the similes come thick and fast in this end, but fear-struck ecstasy of listening. And he presents his rhetorical questions right at the end. Will Hyde die upon the scaffold, or will he find courage to release himself at the last moment? God knows, I am careless. This is my true hour of death, and what is to follow concerns another than myself. Here then, as I lay down the pen and proceed to seal up my confession, I bring the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end. What's so interesting here is that he describes Henry Jekyll as unhappy, because Henry Jekyll is the good side of Jekyll and Hyde, and therefore he should be the happy side of it, but he's not, because he knows what he's caused. So we have a little paradox. Henry Jekyll is happy because he is good, but in knowing that he has put his evil into another being, he cannot be happy. And he also knows that he is not good, because in order for him to be good, he has to cause evil. Okay, so there's this huge paradoxical problem here, that actually something should be happy but can't be happy because it is happy, if that makes sense, vaguely. Okay, so we get this huge paradox at the end of this chunk that causes him to actually sort of try and take his own life in a way. Now the paradox here obviously is the difficulty here obviously is that he sort of cannot. Oh, I think I've just pressed a button that may cause things to. Crap. Oh yeah, yeah. No. Oh shit, that's gone now. Am I actually live at the moment? Oh yeah, I am. Cool. Sorry, that was me. Probably just ended up swearing a lot as well. Okay, so he causes his own suffering in trying to alleviate his own suffering. That's the sort of paradox. Okay, questions. There's a couple of questions coming in. Okay, in Hamza, in the story, generally, can the pathetic fallacy be referred to as a dance macabre because it is a gruesome motif? A dance macabre. Someone's been reading someone's definitely been reading the literary terminology website that I sent out. This is good. Okay, what I think what you're referring to is the sort of general idea that you get a metaphor that's repeated, so essentially a motif that's repeated, that's always on the theme of death. I would struggle to refer to it as a dance macabre. I think that's seriously pushing it. I think seriously pushing it. But I quite like the idea that it's a morbid motif. Is probably better on that. Okay, Asher, in the last chapter, it says how he fears my power to cut him off by suicide. Why is Hyde so scared of being killed? All right, I think my interpretation of this is that he Hyde's selfishness is part of his inherent evil, and his selfishness is partly embodied by the fact that he has a selfish attitude to life. He knows he's evil, but he can't stop himself from being evil because he can't prevent himself from keeping on living. That's really horrible. Sorry, let me try that again. So he knows that he's evil, and that actually the way to stop himself being evil is to kill himself, but he can't kill himself because he selfishly hangs on to his life even though it will cost others their life. For instance, the direct thing is while Hyde exists, then Jekyll can't. If that makes sense. Does that make sense? We answered that. I feel like I've actually answered that. Okay, so unless there's anything comes through in the next couple of minutes, I'm going to wrap up. So tomorrow I'm going to do paper 2. So I'm going to do History Boys and then the poetry, which is going to be considerable. But thank you all for joining me today. I really appreciate the fact that you're actually doing the work over the Easter holidays. And I will see, well, I won't see any of you tomorrow, but you will see me tomorrow if you continue. Okay, don't be afraid to email me questions, particularly if there are particular things you want to go over tomorrow in terms of poetry and History Boys, and I'll try and tailor stuff around them, but otherwise it'll probably be pretty similar. Asher just asking me, after that Jekyll writes, I'll find it in my heart to pity him. So that to show goodness and naivety always loses, kind of like how the nice guy finished last. Yeah, absolutely. Jekyll's like kindness is his eventual downfall. That's sort of what it's getting at, that he can't like stop himself being nice. Yeah, and actually one of the things that Stevenson sort of presents here is that like pity kills you. And actually being nice to people is the ruination of mankind, possibly, which is profoundly depressing. Brilliant. But yeah, you're totally right on that point. Okay, thank you very much, guys, and I will see you tomorrow. Cheers.